How did Mao's army build the People's Liberation Army Navy during the Chinese Civil War? We look at the early years of the PLA Navy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 130 of the Principles of War podcast. From river crossings to amphibious operations, how the PLA built a navy from scratch and learned littoral manoeuvre. I'm very excited about this two-part series which looks at the founding story of the PLA Navy. The story is fascinating. There are lots of lessons to learn. But importantly, the PLA Navy is quite young, so that foundation story is a part of the DNA of the Navy today. To explore this story, I am joined by Dr. Toshi Yoshihara. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Previously, he's been a professor of strategy at the US Naval War College. He's written a number of books, including Red Star Over the Pacific, China's Rise and the Challenge to US Maritime Strategy, and, importantly for us today, Mao's Army Goes to Sea, the island campaigns and the founding of China's Navy. So let's get started. Welcome to the podcast, Toshi. So first off, what's your interest in the PLA Navy?
So I got my start actually looking at the Chinese Navy back in the early 2000s. It was a really interesting time of what you might call intellectual ferment in China when you attend various academic conferences on sea power, on naval affairs. You would hear Chinese strategists and scholars recite, Alfred Thayer Mahan's most bellicose language about seizing command of the sea. And in coming across that bellicosity, it kind of occurred to me, why are these Chinese scholars and strategists citing a long dead American naval sea power theorist? And so as I dug into the research, it turns out that the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Navy, the officialdom in general, they were trying to stimulate essentially an intellectual class of people to begin studying sea power in advance of their maritime and naval ambitions. And so in quick succession, my co-author, Jim Holmes, who is still at the Naval War College, and I published a series of books on China's naval strategy that culminated in our last major book, Red Star Over the Pacific. The second edition came out in 2018, and which really looked at the sources of Chinese sea power. And we made the case that China's turn to the seas was and is going to be a permanent phenomenon in Asian politics. And as I dug further into looking at the Chinese Navy, it occurred to me that it was important to understand the Chinese Navy's origins, because in my view, the origin story of any institution, of any organization, tells us a lot about that organization's attitudes, its worldviews, its institutional personality, its DNA, if you will, that frequently turns out to be far more lasting than we give that origin story credit for. And so I started to look into the history of the Chinese Navy, particularly the origins. And I basically stumbled across troves and troves of information about this very much overlooked element of the Chinese Navy, certainly in the Western literature. And that's what led me to this book, Mao's Army Goes to Sea.
So the PLA is a relatively young fighting force, and it wasn't until April 1949 that the PLA Navy was formed. What were the circumstances that led to the formation?
The story that I tell really starts with the tail end of the Chinese Civil War in early 1949. And so this was essentially following the great land battles in North and Northeast China that really spelled the end of the Nationalists. These were decisive and massive battlefield victory by the communists, and that basically marked the beginning of the end of the Chinese Civil War. And so by then, after those battles, Mao's forces were essentially poised to cross the Yangtze River, the great river that divided North and South China. And the plan was that the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, would cross the Great River and then fan out across South China and then conquer the rest of the mainland. And Mao understood that as he was getting ready to cross the Yangtze River, that he was going to be entering an intensely maritime theater. So we're talking about the coastal provinces of Zhejiang, Fujian, Guangdong. Fujian, of course, is the main province facing Taiwan. And Shanghai, of course, was and remains to this very day a major hub of maritime commerce and maritime activity. And so on top of that was the fact that the defeated nationalists had withdrawn and retreated to Taiwan as an island stronghold, and the nationalists also dug in on a variety of offshore islands along the mainland coast, many of them only just a few miles offshore. So the communist leadership understood in early 1949 that it needed to adapt the PLA, and fairly rapidly, to the maritime domain, and to do so, it needed to establish a navy. And so I'm obviously biased, but in my view, this is in many ways a kind of a remarkable story of how, an agrarian, revolutionary, land-based army made up of the masses, if you will, to make the leap into the seas. And I think to step back a little bit, I think this also is a story, and it's a broader universal story about how institutions are forced to do something very different, doing something that it has never done before, and doing it in an area where the competitor has an advantage. So this isn't just a unique story about the Chinese Navy. I think this origin story really tells a broader story of other organizations. You can think of businesses that have to go into a new line of business that it hasn't done before, and that this new line of business is something that the competitor is very good at, but that in order to survive, that business has to start trying to do something very new. And so I think I tell a broader, sort of a universal story of the challenges of institutions doing something brand new. And of course, the book is ultimately about the origin story of the communists turning to the seas.
What do we know about Zhang Aiping, the founder of the East China Navy?
Zhang Aiping is a singular figure in my volume, and it's primarily because he's not only a remarkable individual, but he also had a remarkable career as a communist revolutionary. So maybe what I'll do is talk a little bit, give you an overview of what he did throughout his communist career, and then talk a little bit about how he got to become the founder of the East China Navy. Zhang joined the communist revolution as a teenager. He had joined the Communist Youth League and became a dedicated communist, from that time on. He had gone through the Long March. So after the failed nationalist encirclement campaign to annihilate the communists escaped the nationalist dragnet and began this very famous Long March to escape to northwest China in Yan'an as the communist base area. And of course, Yan'an became the political and military epicenter from which Mao built up his political military power to lead to his subsequent success in the Chinese Civil War. So Zhang basically accompanied Mao and his comrades, and he rose through the ranks, primarily serving as a political commissar for a variety of military organizations. And what was interesting, and it's something that I regret actually not including in the book, was that a lot of the work that he did in the 30s was engaged in what's called United Front work. So United Front work meant that his job during the War of Resistance against the Japanese was to befriend the enemy, in this case, the nationalists, in a temporary marriage of convenience to join forces with the nationalists to fight the Japanese. But in doing so, the United Front also provided a cover for Zhang and his compatriots to engage in subversion, essentially, to undermine the enemy from within. And I think what's important to note about United Front work meant that Zhang got to know a lot of nationalists. And I think this partly explained, and his work in United Front, in part, I think, explains why he was selected to run the East China Navy. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about why those qualifications came into work. But I think the skills that he developed in United Front work, was critical to his later success, because they were fundamentally about dealing with persuasion, which would turn out to be really important when he founded the East China Navy. Zhang, after founding the East China Navy, would continue to rise through the ranks. He would later lead the Ijiangshan campaign in 1954. It was another major offshore island operation that to this day is considered the PLA's first joint campaign conducted by the Army, Air Force, and Navy. In the 1960s, he was a leading member of the PLA Science and Technology Enterprise, including, most importantly, the so-called two bombs, one satellite program. That program was designed to build the nuclear bomb, the ballistic missile, and the space program. He was then in the 1960s into the 1970s purged, and he was actually purged twice during the Cultural Revolution. And I think he became disabled as a result of some of the injuries that he'd suffered from the tumult of the Cultural Revolution. He gets rehabilitated and he gets to oversee the first launch of China's intercontinental ballistic missile in 1980. And of course, he gets to be the defense minister in 1982. He lives into his 90s till 2003. It's an extraordinary life. It's an extraordinary career. And I think provides the broader biographical context in which he becomes the founder of the East China Navy. So let me now bring us back to the topic, which is the story of his role in founding the Chinese Navy. So we have to start with him becoming injured in late 1945, early 1946 in a car accident. And so he's taken out of action in terms of his role in the beginning of the resumption of the Chinese Civil War in 1946. So he's taken to the countryside for recovery. He actually goes to Vladivostok in the Soviet Union to gain medical attention. He returns to duty just as Mao Zedong was about to cross the great Yangtze River. And the story that I tell, particularly military folks in my presentation to the military audience, is I ask the military audience to step into the shoes of Zhang at the time. So I like to say, just imagine that you're a rising officer in your late 30s and you report to duty looking forward to this very exciting campaign ahead where you get to lead an organization that will finally realize Mao Zedong's dream of conquering all of mainland China. But as you report to duty, your CO springs a complete surprise on you and tells you that you're now going to be in charge of a new startup. And the new startup is creating a brand new Navy out of thin air from scratch. And of course, you object, partly because you understand that you barely have a middle school schooling and that you understand just intuitively that a Navy requires significant amounts of technical skill and knowledge. And so you're like, I'm not qualified for this. And the CO says, well, you're actually not being picked for your naval expertise. You're being picked because of your personnel management skills. So many of the skills that he developed in doing United Front work in the 1930s and 40s. And so that's the reason why you're being picked. And and by the way, the big man upstairs, Mao Zedong himself, handpicked you. So under those circumstances, Zhang Aiping really did have a choice, right? So you have no choice but to accept the job. That as you leave the CO's office, you realize that you have no money, no personnel, no equipment, no office, nothing to get this going. And that is essentially the humble beginnings of the East China Navy, the regional Navy that becomes the laboratory for the National Navy that we now know as the People's Liberation Army Navy, the plan.
So the Navy required a lot of doctrine, a lot of infrastructure, and a lot of technical capability. And China was developing all of this from scratch. And it was doing it while it was actually conducting amphibious operations as a part of the Civil War. So how did the PLA Navy get the personnel that it required?
This was a very difficult time for Zhang Aiping and his subordinates, right? So this is what PLA historians called fighting while building or building while fighting, right? This idea that you're actually trying to create this new institution while you're actually learning on the battlefield of how to engage in naval combat and to conduct contested amphibious operations. So let me start with the kind of the institutional part, your question about personnel. So the naval leadership under Zhang understood very early on that naval power and amphibious power was not just about hardware, not just about things, not just about ships, not about shipyards, not about infrastructure. It was also very much about software, right? So it's really about institutional knowledge, expertise, and importantly, human capital. The people who possess the knowledge and the expertise to make these things, these material things work. And the communists understood that they had none of their own, right? This is, again, an agrarian land-based army that's been fighting an insurgency and then fighting, conventional land battles on the mainland. And so they decided very early on that one way to make up for their personnel shortfall was to recruit and absorb the remnant nationalists who were on the mainland. Now, many of these nationalist sailors and officers had decided to stay back on the mainland for a variety of reasons. You can imagine if you don't want to leave your hometown, right? If you have family, if you have a network of family members on the mainland that you don't want to abandon and leave behind, many of them also had, both implicit and explicit sympathies for the communist cause. Many of them thought, well, the communists have won. Let's see what they do, right? Let's find out. Let's not jump to any conclusions. Maybe the communists will bring some good to this war-torn country. So they took a bet and basically decided to stay behind. And so once the communists took over the major naval facilities along the Great Yangtze River, as well as along the coast, they started to take over various ships, but also absorb the personnel who were still left at those facilities. And not only that, the communists very creatively, pursued amnesty programs, meaning, the nationalists, all of their prior sins would be forgiven if they would just come out in the open and join the communist cause. And they would also engage in very public recruitment drives to bring the nationalists in from the cold. So there was a very deliberate effort to sort of open up communist arms to bring, to kind of embrace the nationalists who had stayed behind. Communist agents also used a variety of their own personal contacts and networks, in particular to bring out senior nationalist officers, including flag officers who had stayed behind in China. I also document in my book how the communists benefited from a series of nationalist naval mutinies, including the entire Second Squadron. So the Second Squadron was a major naval force that was operating along the Yangtze River, defending Nanjing and the approaches to the south bank of the Yangtze River. So this force was designed to stop the cross-river invasion by the PLA. And the defection of the Second Squadron basically opened the gates and allowed the communists to cross the Yangtze River largely uncontested in that area. And in the process, Rear Admiral Ling Jun, who was the head of the Second Squadron, turned over 30 surface combatants and over 1,200 men to the communists. So it's a combination of these leave-behind nationalists, people who were encouraged to come out into the open to join the communists, and the mutineers, all of them that basically became a critical part of the intellectual capital in starting this new navy.
So given the large number of nationalists who joined the PLA Navy in the early days, how was their loyalty ensured?
Absorption was going to be a major task, and it was not an easy process, because what we're really talking about here were essentially former enemies, many of them with blood on their hands, right, having fought and killed the communists. But I think more importantly, these were fundamentally ideological adversaries. The nationalists held very different social and political values. So if you look at the nationalist officers in the Republic of China Navy, they typically came from urban areas. They were frequently better educated. Many of them actually foreign educated. They studied overseas. Some of them went to, for example, the Naval Academy for their college education. They were, more cultured. They were used to living in better urban conditions. They had, of course, lived and traveled abroad. So in general, they were just more cosmopolitan. And I think that stood in stark contrast, with the agrarian, rural-based revolutionaries who constituted the majority of the cadre of the PLA. And so you can imagine that there was just a lot of mistrust and, a lot of misunderstandings and tensions that would arise when you're trying to get these former nationalists to collaborate or to cooperate with the communist cadre. And so trying to integrate former enemies was a really difficult task. But I think what I found fascinating in doing the research for this book was just how pragmatic the communists were, right? The communists understood that the nationalists were their path to achieving naval power, and that they were willing to bend the rules, bend even some of their principles in order to get nationalist cooperation. And so they did tactical maneuvers, if you will, by giving the nationalists better food or allowing them to get paid higher wages. And of course, these types of personnel management tools or methods were very problematic because, of course, this went against the very egalitarian ethos of the Chinese Communist Party, right? Because after all, the reason for being for the CCP was to level the social economic playing field in China. And so doing this in favor of the nationalists was almost like reintroducing the class system, right? And that was very, very ideologically problematic. And what that required then was a lot of smoothing over between these two camps. And again, that meant that Zhang Aiping's earlier work in United Front as a political commissar, he had exactly the kind of personnel management skills and leadership skills to massage those differences. But also there were work being done at higher levels, particularly directed at former nationalist flag officers and senior officers. And, the way that you got their cooperation and their loyalty was to allow them to occupy leadership positions and also assume advisory committee positions to provide input to the naval leadership. And I think one of the most important pivotal moments in this attempt to break the ice, if you will, was in August of 1949 when the former nationalist naval leaders formed a delegation and traveled to Beijing to meet with Mao Zedong and his top subordinates. And in a face-to-face meeting, Mao basically reassured these former nationalists that the past was the past and that it was time to look forward to creating this new People's Navy. And Mao, of course, sort of told them that people who possessed the knowledge and the skills that could unlock this capability. And so this attempt at bringing in people, securing their loyalty, in my view, was very much part of the CCP's United Front work and United Front tradition, which was primarily geared at trying to ally yourselves with your enemies in order to bring them to your side. And so the work and the experiences that the communists had in the 1920s, 30s, and into the 40s then paid off during the post-revolution period as well.
So obviously for a Navy, it's going to need ships. And starting from scratch, how did the Navy go about acquiring ships?
They basically did the best they could under the circumstances, and it was largely improvisational. They just kind of made things up as they worked along. They made things up, they improvised, they made do, they found workarounds and so forth. Again, a high degree, in my research in the book, I was surprised by the high degree of both pragmatism and creativity in starting this project from scratch. And I think this needs to be put into the context of just how problematic the maritime domain was for the communists, because the nationalists essentially had control of the air and of the seas at the time. They were, in fact, able to project power from Taiwan onto the mainland without much contest, especially towards the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the post-revolution era. The nationalists were also technologically and qualitatively superior. And I think the most important part of this equation was that the nationalists actually took the best ships with them to Taiwan, and that whatever that they could not bring, that they had to leave behind, they sabotaged and tried to destroy as many of the leave behind assets as they could. And so the communists were essentially left with leftovers. They were second and third hand ships. And so the communists were faced with what I've described as a hodgepodge fleet, a fleet composed of ships from very different eras, from different countries. There were ships, according to my research, that actually traced its origins back to the pre-Republican era. So from the Qing dynasty, ships that were literally 30, 40 plus years old. So you can imagine from a logistical perspective, this was clearly an operational and maintenance nightmare. Just, think about the need to maintain the seaworthiness of these ships, trying to get spare parts. It was just absolutely a horrendous situation for the communists. On the amphibious side, what I document is that the communists basically had to recruit and conscript the civilian sectors to get the shipping to land troops ashore. And the majority of them were basically fishing boats or fishing trawlers crewed by civilian boatmen to serve as transports. And, I had to remind the reader repeatedly in the book, hey, don't forget, these were non-motorized wooden sailing ships. But I also tell a really interesting story about the plan's first flagship and the kind of the circuitous route by which the communists, had this flagship. So the ship was originally an ocean-going gunship that belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy. This gunship was handed over to the Nationalists as a prize of war. The communists basically seized the ship through a mutiny. They had secret agents aboard, and they caused a mutiny, and they took the ship. But then the communists ended up having to scuttle that ship because the Nationalists at the time still had air superiority. So they were conducting Nationalist air raids against communist shipping. After they scuttled the boat, they ended up salvaging it only after they were able to secure the airspace over the mainland. And then they finally were able to man the ship. And the first thing they did was to appoint a former Nationalist officer to be the ship's CO. And so these are just some of the examples of how, the communists got their hands on these ships and then cobbled them together in a way that they thought would, achieve their operational objectives.
It is an incredible story, and I think you've done a great job in the book about telling all of the myriad of problems that needed to be solved. One thing I think was really interesting was how was the doctrine developed? Because not only they're trying to build a navy, but they're trying to build a navy largely for amphibious operations. So how was doctrine developed, and how much influence came from the United States and the British? And what role did the Soviet Union have to play?
Yeah, so again, in this case, so in addition to personnel and hardware, doctrine was also another area where the communists completely lacked, right? They had no naval doctrine of their own to speak of. Again, a land force fighting land wars. And so what they then did as they turned to developing doctrine was what I would call doctrinal synthesis, which is that they used multiple sources of inspiration to form their own doctrine. But I think the most important one, and I think it's the one that's frequently overlooked, is that the communists tapped into their own traditions. That's in many ways not surprising, right? Institutions turn to what they know best, right? And to apply what they know best to new circumstances. And so they were able to tap into their experiences in land warfare, in conducting guerrilla warfare, and in waging what they call people's war, and use the lessons and the experiences from those areas and apply them to the maritime domain. And what I show in the various case studies, which we'll get to later in the interview, are things like a preference for night attacks, the preference for close-in engagements, a willingness to accept an imbalance in the tactical naval balance of power, but still fight it out because they believed in things like esprit de corps, the fighting spirit to overcome material weaknesses. They were also much more willing to tap into civilian industry and in civilian capabilities to make up for military shortfalls. So in many ways, this sort of presages civil military fusion, right? Their willingness to integrate civilian assets and capabilities for military purposes. So that's sort of one set of a doctrinal source. The second doctrinal source were actually surprisingly Western, right? So as I mentioned, the integration of the Nationalists meant that they were getting advice from flag officers, senior officers, and sailors, and especially for the officers and for the senior officers and the flag officers, is that they were frequently trained overseas in the United States and in Europe. And so they brought a lot of their Western assumptions, Western attitudes, Western views about sea power to their task. And so I would argue that they probably had a pretty large imprint on the communist early thinking about naval doctrine. I think one of the questions that I asked, but that sort of needed further exploration and research, is to see how long lasting that particular influence was. The third source of communist naval doctrine was obviously the Soviets. Mao Zedong decided early on that they were going to depend on and rely on the Soviets for technical help on all military matters. And so the Communist Navy was no different. They relied on Soviet advisors. Hundreds of them came to China to provide advice, to provide technical assistance, and so forth. But I think what's really important about the Soviet source of Chinese naval doctrine is that, at least in the telling by Chinese historians, is that the Chinese communists were actually very selective in what they chose to adapt from the Soviets. And because they understood that they could not unthinkingly borrow from the Soviets that Soviet advice had to be tailored to China's unique local circumstances. And so to me, I think this part of the story is important because this retelling about China's early doctrine and doctrinal development pushes back against a tendency in the West to kind of deprecate this founding period in terms of the indigenous sources of Chinese doctrine. And so this conventional wisdom, of course, is that Chinese naval leaders were basically chosen for their party loyalty. And I think the bumper sticker is more red than expert, right? So, they chose them not for their expertise, but for their loyalty to the party. And that a corollary to that is that they were essentially Soviet automatons, right? That they just unthinkingly borrowed from the Soviets. But I think the history that I document for the book tells a very different story, which is that Chinese naval leaders thought very hard about maritime affairs. They understood the importance of technical expertise and human capital, and that at the same time, they were very careful to apply their own traditions and made selective borrowing from the West and Soviet unions, but merging them and synthesizing them in a way that best suited China's own local conditions.
So once the Navy was formed, how did its relationship with the PLA change? Was it subordinate to the PLA, or was it an entirely separate service, as in a Western Navy?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Zhang Aiping's East China Navy was a regional navy, and the East China Navy was essentially the precursor to what we now know as the East Sea Fleet. And the East China Navy was meant to serve as a laboratory for what would become the National Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy, the plan. And for this task, Mao selected Xiao Jinguang, who was a corps commander and a political commissar, to become the inaugural commander of the naval service. And as they were standing up the plan, there was some initial debate about sort of its place in the command structure. Initially, there were some who advocated making the Chinese Navy a subordinate organization that would be controlled by the General Staff Department. Xiao, of course, after becoming commander, believed that the plan actually had to be an independent strategic service. And he made his case very strongly to the top leadership, including Mao Zedong, and his argument ultimately won out. And the reason that I think his case was persuasive to the top leadership was because Xiao thought big. He was ambitious. He argued that the plan, the Chinese Navy, had to emulate the navies of other great powers, like the US Navy, like the Soviet Union. And he also argued that the plan and its missions and its roles actually intersected with other elements of Chinese statecraft, including diplomacy, China's ability to transport goods and services, Chinese fisheries, and scientific development. And so the way that Xiao crafted his argument was to say that the plan was going to be an element of Chinese sea power. And I think that was what, in many ways, convinced the top leadership to establish the plan as an independent strategic service, as in many ways a co-equal to the Army and later the Air Force. And to do that, institutionally, I think, Xiao was very prudent and clever in making sure that he established the Navy headquarters in Beijing, which, of course, was the epicenter of political power. And that meant that by having headquarters in Beijing, it positioned the Navy to make its case for resources and making its voice heard when there are debates about the Navy's place in China's national priorities. And I just want to touch on another point, again, is about conventional wisdom in the West, or these longstanding narratives. The standard storyline, that you frequently hear about the future of the Chinese Navy and the likely institutional impediments of the Chinese Navy is to go to its title, right? It's the People's Liberation Army Navy, right? And so the title itself suggests that it had, deep army roots. And so therefore, somehow that this title suggests that the Navy project will be limited or will not be able to achieve the ambitions that it set out for itself. I mean, yes, there's no question about that, right? There's no question that the Chinese Navy had deep army roots. After all, Zhang Aiping and Xiao Jinguang were army officers. But I think if you peel it back a little further and look at the origin story more closely, what you find is that its founders were conceptually more ambitious and more sophisticated about the Chinese Navy's place in China's national and military strategy than most Western observers give the plan credit for. And so I think while it's convenient to look at the plan, the title as a shorthand to talk about its deep army roots, I think we need to dig a little deeper and look more closely at its history that suggests that, yes, it has deep army roots, but that its leaders actually had set out, important long-term goals for the Chinese Navy.
We'll leave the discussion there. A big thank you to Toshi for his time and for his expertise in what I think we can all agree is a really interesting topic. Next week, we're going to come back and we're going to discuss the Jinmen and Hainan campaigns. Some very important lessons learnt from those two crucial amphibious operations. Just a quick public service announcement. If you're enjoying this PME, whether in podcast format or on YouTube, so we've got a YouTube channel now which is getting some great reviews, please leave a like or a comment. It really helps us to get the word out there. I'm really keen to hear how you're using the content in your PME program in your unit.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.